Always true.
We ask the questions.
What is needed in the world?
Višestruko nagrađivani američki pisac, aktivista i autor knjige Dvije milijarde halifa, vizija za muslimansku budućnost. Poznati je komentator na brojnim američkim medijima. O položaju muslimana u Americi, islamofobiji i medijima za Al Jazeeru govori Haroon Moghul.
So, Mr. Haroon Moghul, hello and welcome to the Al Jazeera Balkans channel, and thank you so much for taking time to speak to us. Let's talk about your latest book, 2 Billion Caliphs, A Vision of a Muslim Future. First of all, regarding the title of your book, I suppose it comes from the Quranic verse that God has made man his choice as caliph on earth. Talk us through this.
Sure. Well, first of all, thank you so much for having me. It's an honor to be on, and always great to be interviewed by a fellow Haroon. And you're exactly right. The title of the book is actually a reference to the second chapter of the Quran, where God describes the purpose of Adam and Eve specifically, but all human beings, that every person, regardless of their gender, race, class, ethnicity, origin, when they live, where they live, is made to be God's caliph on earth. It's a term that means effectively that we are being asked and we're being held responsible for living up to the challenge of upholding good and creating a better world. And I think it's something that should be and could be at the heart of a new idea of Islam, a new way of looking at being Muslim, which puts more focus and more authority in individuals and less on institutions and governments and hierarchies. I think it's exactly what we need for the kind of future that seems to be around the corner.
Right, but does the term Khalifa fil Ard refer to man in general or to a particular human being who holds the highest religious office within a Muslim society?
Sure, so that's an excellent question. So the interpretation I take is that there's two types of Khalifa, there's two types of caliph. So the first, the one that probably more people are familiar with, is the political caliphate, the office that was created after the passing of the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him. And so you have, of course, figures like Abu Bakr and Omar, and then you have the Abbasids, the Umayyads, the Ottomans, these kinds of governments and monarchies and hierarchies that represented, at least in theory, the apex of Islam in a political sense, in a worldly sense. And then the interpretation I'm asking us to focus on actually goes back to that Quranic story where God says to the angels that he's going to create a caliph on the earth and creates Adam and Eve in the Garden of Eden, with the implication that Adam and Eve, of course, are the initial holders of that office, but at least in theory and in potential, every human being has the ability to live up to that. Obviously in different ways, we all have different capacities, different strengths, different talents, but we all have this sacred status, which is the reason why human life and human individuality is so precious and should be celebrated and valued.
Mm-hmm. Now, which aspects of this book did you find most difficult, most challenging to write about, and to what extent did your own personal experience as a Muslim growing up in America influence your writing?
Well, the book emerges very much out of the trajectory of my life, and I think the life of a lot of Muslims, certainly in the West. I think for your viewers in the Balkans and Eastern Europe especially, but certainly Muslim minority communities in other parts of the West, we have often found ourselves serving, wittingly or not, as ambassadors to a faith that is often misunderstood. And so in doing this pretty much all of my life, from growing up in a very small town to finding myself as a spokesperson for Muslim communities, I was often asked to introduce and present Islam. And that's the background to this book, this idea that how do we explain a faith that it's a bit of a paradox. It at once is so large and so widespread, and yet so hard, it seems, for a mainstream Western audience to understand and appreciate. And so the book definitely grew out of this idea, how do we explain Islam? And I wanted to do something a little bit different. There's a lot of good introductions to Islam out there, so I'm not trying to knock on them, but generally speaking, they focus on how many times do you pray? What are the 5 pillars of Islam? Where do Muslims live? What happened in this year? And that's important. It's good to give people a grounding, but it doesn't get to the heart of why we do things, right? What explains why Muslims act and prioritize and choose the things they do? And so it was very much an excavation, an attempt to get to the heart and soul of Islam, beyond just the outer form, but the inner compelling vision that keeps almost 2 billion people attached to this faith in some way, shape, or form, even when there's so much negativity around it and sometimes, unfortunately, within it.
Now, it seems that unlike many Western authors who tend to focus on, on extremism in Islam, on militancy, on sectarianism and politics, it seems that you are striving to show the other side of Muslims, who they are, how they live their daily lives, their challenges and their aspirations. To what extent would you say you have been successful in your mission? You have written 3-4 books already.
Well, it's an interesting reflection on where we are in the United States today. This might be unfamiliar to some viewers, but there was a primary to nominate which candidate would run for the Republican Party as a senator in the state of Pennsylvania yesterday. And effectively, this is, there's only 100 senators in the US government. It's one of the most senior positions in the US government. And whoever controls the Senate has a tremendous amount of influence in the direction the country moves in. And of course, Donald Trump put his weight behind one candidate, and the Democratic Party was searching for its own candidate. And long story short, last I checked, and this may be out of date, but it was a very close race. Actually, a Turkish man of Muslim faith was Donald Trump's chosen candidate. And so the reason I'm mentioning that is actually, if he wins, he would, I believe, be the first United States senator of Muslim faith or ancestry, and as far as I know, of Turkish background. And the reason I point that out is that you mentioned extremism, and certainly for the last 20 years, a lot of the conversation in America about Islam has been shaped by the war on terror. But after the withdrawal from Afghanistan, as bungled as it was, and certainly what's happening now in Ukraine, the United States is looking for a new foreign policy orientation, and Muslims have sort of found themselves suddenly in this interesting space where we are no longer the center of national attention. And so a lot of diversity that was within Islam is being suppressed. And so I don't know, to answer your question, long story short, I don't know if I've been successful, but I certainly think that there's a lot more happening in the American Muslim community and the dynamic of Muslim in the West than some of our conversations, certainly in the United States, would have permitted us to imagine, and we're playing catch up. And my hope for this book is that it gives Muslims, especially young Muslims, and certainly with a focus on the West, the courage to imagine a new way of defining Islam now that the door is open for us to do that for the first time in pretty much 20 years.
Right. I mean, but how have topics that Muslim authors have been writing about since the 9/11 attacks been changing over the last 20 years? I mean, are Muslims now beginning to write about themselves, or are non-Muslims still the ones who are writing about Islam and Muslims in the United States?
Sure. So excellent question. It's a bit of a mixed bag. I would say that certainly since 9/11, there has been tremendous progress in getting Muslim voices into prominent spaces in media, foreign policy, national security, and in creative spaces, music, plays, movies, books, things like that. And that's very good. And part of it is effectively because after 9/11, a lot of American Muslims who maybe didn't feel that intensively Muslim had no choice but to contend with the Muslim part of their identity. And so those voices have certainly come forward. And in many ways, that's good. I'm certainly not trying to discount that. Where there has been a challenge, and I think this is because of a secular bias in American media, is we still have trouble talking about Islam as a religion. And for most Muslims, their Muslim identity includes a faith-based identity and a component of theology and worship and so on and so forth. And that's been harder. And I've certainly seen that with this book. I think that a lot of mainstream audiences are confused because they're not used to reading a book by a Muslim which takes Islam seriously. They're a little bit more comfortable reading a book maybe about a young woman who comes of age and has to struggle with what Islam means to her. And certainly that adds tremendously to the national conversation. What they don't hear often, as often, is a young woman, say, talking about her religious convictions and commitments. And so my hope is to encourage other Muslims to openly and proudly and creatively write about their faith and their faith identity.
Right, but would you agree that there was a lot of apology literature immediately after the 9/11 attacks with Muslims trying to convince the Western audience that they were not all extremists? Is this changing now? Are American Muslims gaining more self-confidence?
You're right. You're right. There was a lot of apologetic literature, and it is certainly improving. But I am surprised and sometimes disheartened by to what extent there continues to be this reflexive assumption in some Muslim spaces that we have to sanitize Islam for public consumption. And one of the things I've tried to do in this book is be as honest as possible. So earlier you had asked what are some of the hard things I talk about, and I do talk about questions like Islam and politics and Islam and violence and so on and so forth, not in order to validate Western assumptions. I don't have that kind of frame, but simply to say that reality is complicated, history is messy. There are good chapters in Islamic history, and there are really unfortunate chapters in Islamic history. And part of being a confident Muslim anywhere in the world, and certainly in the West, is to have the ability to say, I'm going to look at everything, and I'm going to acknowledge everything. I'm not going to deny it. I'm not going to pretend it's not there. That doesn't mean I have to agree with it or endorse the narrative of some extremist on the right who assumes that Islam is only one thing and a negative thing. Absolutely not. I have no patience for that and no interest in that. But at the same time, I have no interest in someone who basically turns Islam into a fairy tale. We are all human beings. It's 1,400 years of history. There's heroes in Islamic history, and there's unfortunate moments in Islamic history. I mean, we see that all around us in the news day in and day out. And if we lie about that, then we're not only denying the pain of fellow Muslims and fellow human beings, but we're preventing ourselves from addressing real challenges and real problems.
Mm-hmm. Now, being young, educated in the U.S., being a Muslim, an educated Muslim in the U.S. Means navigating multiple identities. Now, you have today Bosnian Muslims, you have Afghani Muslims, you have Turkish Muslim, Malaysian Muslims, Indonesians, and so on and so forth. How is America transforming or impacting Muslim identities? And is there any such thing as being an American Muslim?
Sure. So that's an excellent question. And of course, just a few weeks ago was the end of Ramadan and Eid al-Fitr. And I now live in Cincinnati, Ohio, and attend a masjid, a mosque here in the Cincinnati area. And it was actually astonishing. So it was estimated that 7,000 people attended the Eid namaz, the Eid prayers, and over 3 shifts, and the ethnic diversity on display was simply astonishing. And I don't know if it's easy to say there is an American Muslim identity. There are certain threads and common experiences and common challenges. I mean, we all live in the same country. We all have to negotiate the same basic faith tradition. But it's hard to underscore how much diversity there really is. I mean, there are ethnicities and perspectives from every corner of the planet. These are not large communities. I mean, on the whole, the US Muslim community is maybe 3 to 5 million people, which out of well over 330 million people is just, you know, a handful of maybe 1%, 2%. It's not a lot at all, but within that is incredible. And that's been one of the challenges for American Muslims is how do we negotiate that? You have someone come from, say, Senegal, and someone come from, say, Indonesia, and they come from families where they've been doing things one way for hundreds of years, and suddenly they're literally side by side trying to figure out how to run a masjid together. And so I do think we should be a little bit nicer to ourselves as American Muslims, right? That's a pretty intense experiment. And one of the most telling indicators of just how much diversity there is in American Islam, which surprises even a lot of American Muslims, is that it's estimated that in 2020, almost 1 out of 3 American Muslims voted for Donald Trump, which, you know, superficially people would be shocked and astonished that many people would vote for a candidate who trafficked in Islamophobia and who otherwise was, frankly, quite morally repulsive. But there you have it. That's the landscape of American Islam, and that's what American Muslim leaders and thinkers and writers have to deal with.
Well, that's really interesting what you just said. Let's move on to transatlantic relations between the U.S. and Europe. How do attacks that take place in Europe, say the ones in London, Paris, or Berlin, how are they reflected, and what repercussions do they have on the daily lives of American Muslims such as yourself? I mean, do you feel the heat coming from Europe?
Absolutely. It's part of a common narrative. Unfortunately, I think a lot of people in American Muslim leadership circles were blind to this, whether willfully or not. Certainly, you're mentioning transatlantic relationships. We saw Eric Zemmour, the candidate for the French presidency. Of course, in the end, he didn't make it very far, but he certainly helped to mainstream and catapult Le Pen, the candidate, the woman who basically came in a pretty close second, and really brought some of the really ugly ideas about Muslims and these myths and fears and stereotypes into mainstream conversations. What I would insist on, and I think is important to stress, is that these are not isolated to Muslims. And so Just several days ago, there was a horrific attack in Buffalo, New York, where a white supremacist, 18 years old, killed, I believe, 10 Black Americans, many of whom were quite elderly, at a grocery store. And sadly, given the way mass violence is happening in America now, we tend to downplay these attacks because we've become numb to them. They just happen over and over and over again, which of course is not normal and should not be something we are numb to. But there is a larger frame that's happening here. So this white supremacist was motivated by replacement theory, the idea that people of color are deliberately being moved into Western societies in order to replace and destroy the white population. And sometimes the target is Muslims, sometimes the target is Jews, sometimes the target is African Americans, sometimes it's Latinos, but there's a larger frame that's being constructed, that's happening on the right, that's pushing towards the center, and that is capturing political power in some places. And so one of the arguments I make in 2 Billion Caliphs, and I hope that Muslims all over the West make, is that we are all in this together, that the future of the West really depends on a liberal, a classical liberal, pluralistic society where we are fighting for each other's rights. Because if one community goes down, all communities are vulnerable. And that's not just a strategic argument, but a moral argument as well.
Right. So would you say that American and European far-right extremists are, do they see themselves as being on the same front, fighting a common perceived enemy?
Absolutely. There's tremendous overlap. You would know this much better than I do, but of course, many of the nastiest and most vicious acts and the rhetoric that came out of extremist groups in the Balkans, for example, in the 1990s, circulate as far afield as Australia and New Zealand. So in the Christchurch massacre, we saw language from what was the genocide in Bosnia being transported into the context of New Zealand by an Australian who was in New Zealand to commit a massacre against Muslims. And so there's definitely circulation. I think the problem sometimes for people in observing this is that it doesn't cohere that well. So on the one hand, you've got Donald Trump promoting Islamophobia. On the other hand, he's endorsing a candidate in Pennsylvania of Muslim background. And so it's a fluid situation. It's hard to know quite exactly how it's going to unfold, but there is reason to be concerned. And I think that we should go from there, not just rhetorically, to building real links communally, intellectually, creatively, financially, spiritually between Western Muslim communities, learn from each other's experiences, understand each other's challenges, and figure out how to advocate meaningfully for each other, not just in the context of Muslim communities working together, but really understanding, for example, there was, when Ukraine started in February 2022, to understand, for example, that the lack of attention the West is paying to Bosnia actually has consequences for all of the West. It's not just about Bosnia. It's not just about Muslims in Bosnia. It's about the entire post-war order, the liberal order, and the idea of pluralistic democracy. So we need to see these places as linked, as connected, and that we have an urgent responsibility morally as Muslims, as citizens of the West, as human beings, to advocate for each other and understand that any weakness, any gap in the larger structure is going to be exploited by people without, like Putin, or within, extremists like Islamophobes, in order to advance a very dangerous agenda.
Mm-hmm. Now, going back to your book, can one be an apolitical Muslim writer in America? I mean, how is it even possible to write a book about Islam, knowing that Islam, politics, and the media shape the very image of Islam and the way Muslims are perceived?
Yeah, that's a challenging question. What I will say is that for me, part of the reason for writing this book was a concern that we have a lot of emphasis in certain Muslim spaces on identity. And what we lose in the process is our faith conviction. And I think that's a tragedy. That's really unfortunate. Because ultimately, if we look at this generationally, if I want Islam to survive and to thrive in the world, then I have to be able to sacrifice in a meaningful way to propagate the ideas and values of Islam in healthy and productive ways. And if it's merely a matter of identity, as in, this is what my parents did and this is what their parents did, that's in a pluralistic society like America, that's not going to survive more than a generation or two. And that would be a loss, not just for American Muslims, but for American society more broadly. And so what I'm asking Muslims to do is revisit what is actually at the heart of Islam, which is this idea that we are created by God to be caliphs, to live out a vision of good in the world, to worship the divine, to center our lives on the divine, and to advocate for better, more merciful and compassionate societies. I don't think those two things are separated. What I am fighting against is a narrow vision of Islam that is politicized. What I'm hoping for is a moral vision of Islam that encourages us to act productively and meaningfully and compassionately and beautifully in the world without saying what that is. And so as a small example, I'll take the issue, maybe for a lot of European viewers, it doesn't make much sense, but in the American context, we have a big problem with healthcare. A lot of Americans do not have health insurance. I personally think that this is a gross injustice and a tragedy. I don't want to say that Islam has a particular agenda. I will say that Islam has values, including concern for the poor, recognizing that whatever we have in our life is from God, and that to honor God, we share what we have. So I could say that I'm encouraging people to build a more compassionate society, but I don't want them to believe that Islam has specific prescriptions. No, Islam has values and ideas that encourage us to use our brains and to apply our reason without forcing us into certain outcomes. So if someone's moral conscience compels them to address the environment, to address poverty, to address racism, that's great. And then let's have a democratic debate with people of all faiths and backgrounds about how we reach the outcome that we want to see, what strategies we take to get there, and be willing to learn if we make mistakes along the way.
Well, now let me ask you something. Do people such as yourself have access to mainstream US media, or do Western media outlets prefer to invite pundits such as Irshad Manji or Ayan Hirsi Ali, who are not representative of the Muslim society, and who will say what the Western media outlets want them to hear, and who will thereby contribute to a very skewed image of Islam with a heavy accent on apostasy, hudud punishments, or extremism in Islam?
Yeah, I mean, it's funny that you mentioned Irshad and folks like that. I had a debate on Fox News with Irshad Manji, and it was a good conversation, but of course at the end of the day, we ended up in very different directions. And it is changing. There's more diverse perspective. I think a lot of these figures and really monopolized the discourse, especially in the years after 9/11. And then people realized very quickly that they were not representative of the broader Muslim community. And indeed, no one is. I'm certainly not. I have my own perspective and my own story and my own ideas, but I don't know how representative I am of the vast majority of American Muslims. All I can do is speak to my experiences and my exposure to American Muslims. What I will say is that is changing, but part of the onus lies on American Muslims and Western Muslims. With yourself as a wonderful exception, many Muslim communities in the West do not emphasize the humanities. We don't emphasize literature, we don't emphasize teaching, we don't emphasize storytelling, we don't emphasize journalism, we don't emphasize law and government. We tend to focus on technical fields, science, engineering, medicine, and that's great. We want that, we need that. Certainly for innovation and for addressing the world's problems, those are great things. But where are the Muslim storytellers? Where are the Muslim journalists? I'm actually, I have to say, shocked that many of the people I see in positions of leadership in religious spaces in American Muslims tend to have science and engineering degrees. And I don't see how a more black and white worldview, a mechanistic worldview, really prepares you to be in a position of religious leadership. If we look at Islamic history, most of the great sages of Islam were writers, they were poets, they were storytellers, they were the equivalent of novelists and journalists. They had the ability to capture the nuances and experiences of their societies. And I'm not saying that one path is necessarily better. I'm saying that there's an incredible imbalance. And so you get the representation you invest in. If we as a community don't invest in creating a generation of people who can advocate on our behalf, then exactly as you said, other people will advocate on our behalf. And then
but there are individuals such as Linda Sarsour, Omar Suleiman, Dalia Mogahed, yourself, and many Dalia Fahmy, who are well-educated, prominent, practicing Muslims. Are they changing the paradigm of what it means to be a Muslim in America?
Absolutely. I mean, just as an example, I've followed Linda's work for years. We were in New York at the same time. She's done a remarkable job in bringing attention to disenfranchised communities, minority communities, marginalized communities, certainly Palestinian communities. You mentioned Omar Suleiman, one of the most compelling and creative thinkers in a religious space. What I'm drawing attention to is that it's not enough. And I'm not by any means trying to say that they're not doing a great job. What I'm trying to say is that if we look at how many Muslims there are in the world, and this is something that animated the book, how is it, like I want us to really think about that. 2 billion people, almost 1 in 4 people on the planet can't tell their own stories, right? And there's so many reasons for that. I'm not discounting the colonialism, the marginalization, the imperialism. I'm not discounting that. But we should be able to define ourselves and not have to worry about fringe people affiliated with extremist think tanks and extremist narratives defining us. I mean, that's a reality. I mean, there are Islamic extremists, there are Islamophobic extremists, but the vast majority of Muslims have nothing to do with either of those extremes. And yet those stories are largely missing or not told often enough. And that's what I'm trying to get Muslims in the West to see, that we are doing ourselves a disservice. The expression basically is we punch below our weight, right? We don't have the impact on the world that our numbers and our resources should permit us to. And that's because we haven't activated our numbers of resources in ways that enable us to translate convictions and beliefs into positive outcomes. And so we are talked about, we don't talk.
I'm afraid we'll have to end here. Haroon Moghul, it's a pleasure speaking to you. Thank you so much once again for your time.
Thank you so much.